Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have a good one for you, as always. Here is what we got on the show. We have a surprise deal: $369 billion in climate and tax forged by the Senate Democrats on Wednesday. Finally, figuring out a deal that every single one of them, including apparently Joe Manchin, can work with. We're going to break it down from the New York Times and Common Dreams perspectives on this, give you the two angles, and just not give you the straight up, New York Times pro-Democratic Party spin on this. Also, we're going to look at the latest rate hike, what's been going on there in the Federal Reserve and the interest rates, and why critics are saying Jerome Powell is making a big mistake yet again. That's including economist Robert Reich saying rate hikes will force millions of Americans into joblessness and make families poor. It's the last thing we need right now. And finally, the free market is making all of our problems worse, not better, writes Pablo Garibaldo in Jacobin. The world is on fire all around us. The free market can't put that fire out. Only massive state intervention in the economy can. This is Newsflash. Thank you so much for listening. It's a Thursday. All right, let's get right into it today. And starting at the top, we are starting today, of course, with the surprise deal in the New York Times today and in the Senate. $369 billion in climate and tax package forged in a surprise deal by Senate Democrats on Wednesday would be the most ambitious action ever taken by the U.S. to try and stop the planet from catastrophically overheating. Again, still probably not really very enough. So Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a key centrist Democrat, announced on Wednesday he'd agreed to include hundreds of billions of dollars for climate and energy programs and tax increases in the package to subsidize healthcare and lower the cost of prescription drugs. They're finally going to go through with it in a big package, hundreds of billions of dollars for climate and energy programs and tax increases in the package to subsidize healthcare and lower the cost of prescription drugs. So it's a multifaceted situation. I think it's going to be interesting to see where they're putting the money in this bill, and I think this kind of a bill would be a start for something like, a last chance to up the nose of the nosediving plane before the midterms. So the package assigns $369 billion for climate and energy proposals, the most ambitious climate action ever taken by Congress. Ambitious in that it's just a relatively small amount of money, especially towards the problem and the scope of the matter. It's just the fact that it's ambitious for the U.S. Congress and the fact that the U.S. Congress really has done nothing on this issue of any kind of real substance. They've raised an estimated $451 million in new tax revenue over a decade while cutting federal spending on prescription drugs by $288 billion, according to a summary circulated Wednesday evening. So the product of a deal was announced by Manchin and Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, the majority leader, and would reduce the federal deficit by about $300 billion while seeking to push down the cost of healthcare, prescription medicines, and electricity. So we've kind of seen a very interesting interchange in events take through with this over the past 2 weeks, because about a week or so ago, maybe it was 2 weeks, I don't really remember, we had Joe Manchin come out in public and say, you know what, I'm not doing any of this climate deal, this is just getting ridiculous. And then something happened, some sort of inciting event that we really, I think, don't know about quite yet, happened where he continued to go to the negotiating table and this deal eventually emerged. The plan does fall short of the ambitious policy and domestic policy and tax package Biden proposed last year, but Democrats looking towards midterm elections that are likely to be shaped by voters concerned about certain costs have pitched it as a targeted attack on the rapid price increases that have soaked American consumers in the wallet this year, with inflation running at a 40-year high. This is something that, if the Democrats want to have any chance at maintaining anything, really does need to pass here, just to show that there is a point to re-electing them, that they can actually pass a bill beyond, really basic COVID-19 relief at the beginning of the term. With that being said, it really is, it's very, very important here to get into some of the details. The announcement suggests that Democrats can move in the coming days to salvage a major piece, though, of their domestic agenda, which only weeks ago appeared to be doomed given Manchin's refusal to quickly sign on. Top Democrats released legislation on Wednesday evening, that was last night, aiming for votes as early as next week. This is action the American people have been waiting for, Biden said in a statement, calling on both chambers to quickly pass the measure. This addresses the problems of today: high healthcare costs, overall inflation, as well as investments in our energy security for the future. It was not clear what had changed Manchin's mind since he said not even 2 weeks ago he cannot support such a package until he saw new inflation numbers for July, which are not scheduled to be issued for 2 more weeks from now. But quiet negotiations have resumed after Manchin, Schumer, and their staffs in recent days, according to a person familiar with the talks. So that is very interesting. And what I really want to know is what card did the Democratic leadership here in Schumer and maybe, someone in the White House, maybe even Nancy Pelosi, although I, kind of doubt it, to get Joe Manchin to come back to the negotiating table and actually get this thing done. It's very, very interesting. So the abrupt announcement came only hours after a huge industrial policy bill aimed at bolstering the American competitiveness with China that Senator Mitch McConnell had long said he would never support as Democrats continued to their efforts to push through the marquee domestic policy bill over GOP opposition passed. So we get the CHIPS bill. That's, investing in, tech to be more competitive with China. And then that is something the Democrats have had passed. And then all of a sudden, we could see, Joe Manchin, this big hurdle clearing. Could we see it happen? But then, of course, you got the filibuster and what happens there. Democrats need unanimous support within their party in the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Kamala Harris to pass the plan under special rules that shield certain budget bills from a filibuster. So this is actually going to work because it can go through the parliamentarian and go past the filibuster. Manchin's resistance has been the primary obstacle to doing so all along, handing him effective veto power over its contents and the final say over whether any measure could pass the Senate. So the question here is, why is this happening now? What is the story here? And, I think it really does remain to be seen. Some skepticism, though, on this issue. Jessica Corbett in the in Common Dreams. Yeah, so while Democratic leaders on Wednesday celebrated a surprise budget reconciliation here with Senator Joe Manchin on new climate and tax policies, progressive campaigners had a range of responses from cautious optimism to skepticism to outright concern. Manchin and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer unveiled what Politico would call Washington's best-kept secret less than 2 weeks before the August recess and less than 2 weeks after Manchin signaled he wasn't open to new climate and tax reforms right now. The new agreement is the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, that is, follows months of tense negotiations after Manchin last year killed the House-approved Build Back Better Act, which was backed by most of his Democratic colleagues, President Joe Biden, American voters, and progressive advocates. With more than 85 million Americans currently under a heat advisory, we are facing a climate emergency, and we must address it in ways that advance justice and jobs. I commend Senator Schumer, President Biden, and the entire Democratic caucus for reaching a deal on legislation, says Margie Alt, the director of the Climate Action Campaign, in a statement. So that is one response from one of those groups there, but it's definitely a mixed response. This is the Sunrise Movement's response on Twitter. The system is rigged when one man who profits off of fossil fuels can hold life-saving climate legislation hostage and again water it down, as we've seen him do for years now. But if 50 senators are actually committed to voting for a passage that reduces emissions by 40% by 2030, let's get into details here. This is something that would be a pretty significant pretty significant move and a great step, to build on. We do have to go further from here. 40% of reduced emissions by 2030. Pretty much the scientific community says that is not enough. Net zero emissions by 2030, 2050. That is something that is probably what most of the countries in the world, even conservative Britain, are aiming for or have been aiming for. Their leadership is in flux right now, as you may know, but it does stand to reason here that we are seeing a pretty significant move in the right direction if this were to pass, because that could go through the parliamentarian. It could pass, I don't know if they can get it done before the August recess, but it would be good considering they're going to about to take the month off, and then it's pretty much midterm time, and you are all the way through. So, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of interesting dynamics there to play, while echoing the message that American policymakers must immediately and ambitiously take on the climate emergency. Food and Water Action Executive Director Winona Hodder expressed concerns that Manchin highlighted, it is truly above all, which means it is truly all of the above. Sorry. Manchin highlighted this bill does not arbitrarily shut off our abundant fossil fuels. Manchin supporting it. Maybe this will lend some support to kind of the independent crowd and the conservative crowd who have really kind of been spouting this really ridiculous idea that Biden is this anti-fossil fuel president who's approved more drilling permits than Trump has. At this point in his time in office by a large margin. Like, this is someone who's completely enabling and supporting the American oil companies and not making any specific effort, any real effort beyond sitting them in a room and yelling at them maybe in a stern way, or maybe that's what he'd probably like us to believe he's doing when the gas prices are high. That is literally about it in terms of what he's doing to get in the way of, our wonderful, heroic fossil fuel companies. So noting that as part of the deal, Biden, Schumer, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have also agreed to reform the permit process for energy infrastructure before the end of the fiscal year. Hatter warned that streamlining permitting for natural gas pipelines and exports is not climate action. It is the opposite. More subsidies for hydrogen, carbon capture, and nuclear energy are not climate action. They are the opposite. So it does seem like, there's some legitimate criticism here of the methods. And there is a little bit of some of these poison pills in here. So Joshua Siegel writing this in a tweet. This piece of Manchin-Schumer agreement on energy deal would have to be outside reconciliation, advancing a suite of permitting reforms this fall to ensure all energy infrastructure from transmission of pipelines to export facilities can be efficiently and responsibly taken out. So that is something that, yes, we need to speed up the permitting for clean renewable energy, but if not if it also fast tracks climate destroying fossil fuel projects. So they want to do both here in this, so they're trying to really speed up. And when the process is speed up, the permitting process is sped up, who's going to have the resources, who's going to have the ability to pretty just walk right through? It's going to be the fossil fuel companies. Using the budget reconciliation process allows Senate Democrats to bypass the GOP filibuster. But due to the Democratic Party's narrow control of the upper chamber, the bill must be supported by the full caucus, including Manchin and fellow obstructionist Senator Kyrsten Sinema, to pass. The so-called deal forced by Senator Manchin is what we'd expect when Congress so closely divided and friends and beneficiaries of the fossil fuel industry have effective control over quote-unquote climate policy. It proves we need to elect more climate champions so that we can pass the policies actually needed to confront the crisis we all face. Until then, we shouldn't accept deals that strengthen the oil and gas industry to the detriment of us all. Morris Pearl, chair of Patriotic Millionaires, wondered on Wednesday whether the bill would even make it to Biden's desk, given the right-wing Senate Democrats' track record. We'll believe it when we see it pass on the floor of the Senate. And, beyond all of that, I think that is something, I think this would probably be, for the most part, a step in the right direction. Better than nothing, probably not that, not entirely that strong. Although I do have to kind of look into more of it, I guess to say, to make my full opinion and state it confidently. But from what I've seen, what I've been looking into pre-show and here on the show, I think it is something that would be definitely is something that they should pass. But the question obviously remains now, will they? My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say. So please do those steps. Make SWR content better. And thank you so much for listening. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to today's show. We're talking about interest rates today, and this is in Common Dreams here. Kenny Stansel writing, U.S. Federal Reserve is on the verge of causing a disastrous surge in unemployment, Progressive said Wednesday, after the nation's central bank raised interest rates for the second consecutive month, doubling down on its dogmatic quest to reduce prices, even as slowing wage growth offers more evidence that inflation is being driven by corporate profiteering and supply chain issues rather than excessive demand driven on by, as many people in power would like you to believe, way too much money in Americans' pockets. Like wage growth will fall, inflation probably will remain the same. Then we will see the real truth. Rate hikes will force millions of Americans into joblessness and make families poorer. University of California, Berkeley public policy professor Robert Reich wrote on social media after the Fed once again increased its benchmark policy rate by 75 basis points. That's 0.75 of 8%. Just like last time we talked about in the Volcker shock episode, or the Powell shock episode. Every time over the last half century, the Fed has raised interest rates this much and this quickly, it has caused a recession. The string of rate hikes that began in March has intensified this summer, represents the central bank's most forceful cycle of monetary tightening since 1981, when then Fed Chair Paul Volcker imposed an unprecedented regime of financial austerity that's now widely seen as a key turning point in the ruling class-led assault on working-class living standards. Working people are struggling, added Reich, who served as labor secretary under former President Bill Clinton. The Fed is making a big mistake. Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, also responded with concern to the Fed's latest rate hike. With the Federal Reserve's pace of monetary tightening now the fastest in decades, I have serious concern that President Joe Biden's promise to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out is now at risk. We are all concerned about the impact of inflation and rising costs, but today's decision to raise interest rates will do nothing to address their primary causes. John Paul noted that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has admitted that soaring energy and food prices are in fact related to pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and the war in Ukraine. The supply constraints, not excess demand, are responsible for persistent inflation. And by causing high interest rates to deliberately slow the economy, the Fed could cause hardship to millions of Americans by unnecessarily increasing joblessness while failing to significantly reduce the price of essential goods and services. That is something that I think will be very, very interesting. Another way to really see credibility loss when it comes to, neoliberal economics and people who are so hell-bent, in pushing this standard on all of us. And so like, the fact that we're still on the same policy that we were using in 1981, and it's going to be interesting to see, if prices do go down from this, if prices don't go down from this, but I just think that the idea that you're looking at this situation here, if you're people in power, if you're Jerome Powell, if you're a respectable economic mind, and you're coming out there and saying, oh, the reason inflation is happening is because Americans have too much money in their pockets. They're spending too much. They need to get back to work. Like, that is something that just is not driven out by the facts of the case whatsoever. Because it's like, where is this coming from? Where is this excessive demand? The excessive demand, I think, where is this? That's one question. The second question is, where are all these funds coming from? Where is the supply coming from, the money supply coming from to buy all this stuff? Is it from those stimulus checks? I think that is just an absurd case to make. It may be from the money supply has increased, and it has increased from the money the Federal Reserve has just, kind of funneled up to the stock market. But there are also, tons of pandemic-related concerns, supply chain issues, and, of course, the war in Ukraine, all these other factors, and tons of corporate profiteering off of this inflation narrative. So polling released this month showed that the majority of U.S. voters are opposed to precipitating a recession to tame inflation. What a surprise. At a time when the Biden administration has been working to reach full employment, creating nearly 9 million jobs and decreasing unemployment to its lowest levels in 50 years, raising interest rates risks reversing that trend and forcing employers to lay off employees who just got back to work or slow hiring to a halt altogether. So it's a very scary, or, not good, to say the least, type of situation here. And it's very hard to see a good way out of it. So John Powell urged the Fed to really exercise the utmost caution going forward and resist the urge to further raise interest rates. With wage growth declining in recent months, our country's lowest paid, most vulnerable workers have endured too much already to be sacrificed in pursuit of severe rate hikes that have far too often triggered recessions. Claudia Sam, a former Federal Reserve and White House economist in the Obama administration, argued in a Financial Times opinion piece that the notion the United States needs a recession to bring inflation down hinges on a simplistic model of the economy and refusal to see COVID and the war in Ukraine as important sources of inflation now. The stakes are too high to rely on such a questionable approach. Recession is worse than inflation, wrote Sam. A lost paycheck or even lost hours would far exceed extra monthly costs due to inflation. And of course, why, if everything else is not working and inflation is just soaring sky high, then, that is something that I think is, a logical thing to pursue. But why do something that would be worse to fix this problem? Would cost working Americans more to fix this problem. The rate hike, the policy-induced recession here, before you have exhausted every other possible option of, exploring the corporate profiteering, exploring supply chain issues resulting from COVID and the war in Ukraine. I mean, I just do not get it unless you're pursuing a, corporate-first economic policy, which these people clearly are. All right, so with that being said, we are going now to move on to our final story of the day. And this is a little bit of an opinion piece from Paolo Garbaudo. He is writing in Jacobin. He's a sociologist at King's College London and author of The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic. So he writes, the world is on fire all around us. Mainstream politicians these days are constantly looking for excuses to justify their divergence from market dogma. From the pandemic to energy crisis, the war in Ukraine to growing inflation, ever new crises are forcing policymakers to use heavy state intervention, which neoliberals saw as their sworn enemy, to prop up markets. And, these systems, these markets have gotten so free, they pretty much corrupted government. They corrupted any sort of regulatory authority, any sort of ability to keep it in control and continue to ensure that it functions in any kind of logical method that is fair to people, which has been, pretty interesting to watch, to say the least. So these interventions are justified as emergency measures necessary to guarantee continued economic operations before it can coveted return to market normality, which is, however, always postponed. Just witnessed the European Central Bank saying just in April it would stop purchasing bonds, only to announce new bond and buying address ballooning borrowing costs. A new bond and buying to address ballooning borrowing costs in countries like Italy. So that's, more market intervention in the economy. And the question is, when is normal going to happen? Is it ever going to happen? Again, will we ever return to, the neoliberal orthodoxy that so many of these central bank leaders want to get to, but just can't because the circumstances are just too bad? To date, the state interventionism we've seen coming from both center left and center right over the last decade, and more clearly since the explosion of the COVID pandemic, has closely followed the logic of facilitating a return to, quote, normal market conditions. By now, However, it's become apparent there's no way to go back to the old normal. Economic conditions have drastically changed, and the premises and expectations that have accompanied the era of neoliberal globalization do not offer any credible guidance anymore. Faced with the farcical attempt by political mainstream to use the state interventionism to restore market society and protect wealth, the left should try and use this opportunity to reclaim the socialist tradition of progressive state interventionism as a means to transform society and shift power relations. In fact, the proactive use of the state as a means to construct a new society was common to different strands of the left. It was not just an idea harbored by Leninists who aimed to construct a command economy with state ownership covering virtually every sector, but also held in different ways by social democrats who led the transformation of old liberal states into welfare states, talking about a place like Great Britain, for example, after the war, and, the massive amounts of social democracy that took over Europe at that time because of the popularity of people on the left seizing the moment to make this drastic change after the drastic circumstance change that was represented in World War II. So the state understood it as a battlefield of class struggle, as Nikos Poulantzas famously put it, and the point of the left was conquering new trenches in the sprawling state apparatus or radically democratizing it. Yeah, so that is what it should be doing. It should be expanding. It should be pushing for these kind of outcomes to have democratic control of the state, have worker control of the state, to bring it to as many essential organs as possible. Start with things like healthcare. Start with things like housing. Start with key industries of energy. These things are so important to constructing a fair society. And the pandemic, the supply chain crisis, inflation, all that stuff, we have seen that time and time again. This view of left state interventionism lost part of its allure in the aftermath of the working class defeat of the 1970s and 80s, and because of the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the evidence of its economic inefficiency, the neoliberal revolution managed to convince citizens in a globalizing world that state intervention was doomed. Neoliberal politicians like Bill Clinton presented globalization as the economic equivalent of a force of nature, like wind or water, that it would be stupid to try and reverse, while Barack Obama in 2016 also used the term "it was a fact of nature." Politics was presented as the management of the necessity of globalization, while economic decisions limited to those acceptable to international investors, with some sections of the moderate and soft left broadly accepting these ideological premises. Yet now we find ourselves at a juncture when this vision of globalization as inevitable and permanent, and of the state as a weakling creature, have been patently demonstrated to be empirically dubious and historically anachronistic. I mean, look at, when we saw in the coronavirus crisis, when we saw in power at the time, Rishi Sunak, I think in Great Britain is a very interesting example. Rishi Sunak, key hardcore conservative, he was big person behind, a scheme where, as they call it in England, a scheme is literally just a plan where they allow you to keep 80% of your wages, keep you in employment, and something that, turned out to be incredibly effective and represented a bunch of state intervention, a massive state intervention that he did not want to really do at the time, but had to because it was necessary and because the market system was just horrifically inefficient for any kind of crisis, any kind of hardship that was outside of the norm. Part of the change we are witnessing is not so much practical as epistemic, namely it has to do with how we perceive and know the world. In fact, contrary to liberal gospel, state intervention never really went away. As many political economists have shown, the neoliberal project and the very existence of globalization was always premised on state patronage, for example, establishing the necessary regulatory frameworks and repressing protest. But at the rhetorical level, this narrative of the weak state had important ideological implications. It served to restrict the range of acceptable policies to those that were in the interest of the international capital. This fiction was aided by the peculiar conditions of the Great Moderation. The era between the 1980s and 2000s marked by limited macroeconomic volatility, low inflation, and low interest rates. Under the illusion of stability, the long 90s economic policy appeared as if on automatic pilot, amounting to limited interventions, small nudges to the market, which could be presented as limited exercise in course correction, tactical rather than political decisions. However, And the crisis of capitalism is now so profound that it is not anymore possible to maintain this pretense. Economic decisions appear immediately as political decisions, hence ones where different interests are at stake and where all too often the interests of business continue to be put before the interests of workers. This was evidenced with Bidenomics, where the infrastructure package that was in the interest of the companies passed, while the social measures, part of the so-called Build Back Better package, was stopped by Congress because of opposition of Democratic senators who expressed major worries that state aid to the poor, while applauding at the same time state aid for quote-unquote entrepreneurs. With that being said, that's all the time we have on the show today. We will see you back on Tuesday.